Sorry to interrupt. Can we record?
Yes.
Thank
Yes,
you.
just started it. Thank you very much.
Right. Also, as some of my associates have reminded me, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that I am also on the organizing committee for the Pittsburgh chapter of World IA Day, which is happening on February 27th. So if y'all are looking for something fun to do on the 27th, you should check that out. It's going to be a good time. So with that, I will start to share my screen. And present. Okay, so the talk that I'll present to you tonight is called Sound as Accessibility, How Acoustic Anthropology Can Make Design More Inclusive. At the bottom of this screen, I want to read out before I begin, there is an accessible version of my slideshow. It's bit.ly/sounda11y, so bit.ly/sounda11y. And all the images have alt texts, and I think it should be pretty accessible, at least I hope so. I did my best with it. The talk tonight is divided into three parts. The parts are oriented first towards talking about a little autobiographically how I moved from studying music into thinking about sound, then how I have tried to incorporate sound into research, and then finally how we might be able to connect both of those things to work in accessibility. Each of these three areas obviously has quite a bit more depth than I'm able to go into in this talk tonight, which I suppose is kind of a disclaimer-ish way of saying that if you're a musicologist, a designer, a researcher, or an accessibility specialist, you may end up a little dissatisfied with at least one part of this talk, but hopefully in the Q&A we can dig into some things a little bit further. All right, so I will begin with part one, which is sound as knowledge. And as Jack said in introducing me, I am, by training, I am an ethnomusicologist, and I get asked quite a bit, what is an ethnomusicologist? And the answer really is pretty straightforward. An ethnomusicologist is essentially a cultural anthropologist who studies music. In my case, I was doing research on recording studios for classical music in the United Kingdom, which involved sitting in control rooms, learning how producers and engineers talk to musicians and how they translate their ideas into sound through the technologies that they use in the studio. And just to give you a bit of an illustration, and by way of introducing some of the sound ideas I'm going to get into tonight, I want to tell you one of my favorite stories from the research that I did in this area. The thing I'm going to tell you about is a recording session from the Tonhalle Orchestra in Zurich. I watched them record Mahler's 10th Symphony. This would have been in 2010, I believe. You know, it's a huge piece of music, big orchestra, you know, took days to record. But the thing that interested me most here in thinking back on it was a moment on the first day where in the first movement of this symphony, there's a really difficult transition for the orchestra where they have to make a tempo adjustment that's not an obvious mathematical ratio. It's sort of hard to anticipate what it's going to be. There's a subtle dynamic change, and there's maybe 80 musicians or so doing this simultaneously. So it's pretty hard to get everybody to make this transition together. And on the first day, the orchestra is playing through the symphony just for the first time, and they get to that transition and they nail it, and it is perfect and it's really beautiful. And all of us in the control room sort of stopped and looked at each other because it was really like one of those moments that makes the hair stand up on your neck or something. And then the producer shouts, "It sounds like an edit. We can't put it on the record. They're going to have to do it again." And this caught me by surprise because I had not yet sort of figured out some of the principles that these producers and engineers are working from here, which is that it's actually possible to have a performance be too perfect to show up on a record. And the reason for that is because people often think that recorded performances refer to live performances, but that's really generally not the case. More often, the reference point for a music recording is other recordings. And what I learned from this, this incident and this recording session is that my role as a researcher there was to learn to hear how other people hear, to learn to listen the way other people listen. And I learned that not by, just by, sitting there and observing and seeing how the producer and the engineer responded, but also learning from the producer how he was anticipating how other people listen, how people who buy records and listen to records, how they listen, and what those people perceive is what he tries to anticipate when he's producing a record. There's, these layers of learning to listen through another person's ears. That was fundamentally what my research was about. So now I want to play you a short recording having nothing to do with that research. This is a performance by the Scottish percussionist Evelyn Glennie in Grand Central Station. It's maybe 2.5 minutes long, and I'm going to play the whole thing because I think it's pretty neat. The thing that I'm interested in here is not so much the performance itself, although that's awesome, but also the way that this video allows us to perceive how the sound behaves in the space that she's in, this big train station. And that's all I'll say for now. So some things that are interesting about that performance to me is the way that it resonates in that room. I mean, like I said, the performance is excellent. It's really, she's a fantastic musician, but the way that it's captured, you perceive like the sonic qualities of the space that she's in addition to her playing, the cavernous, hard surfaced resonance of a room like that. And the video is great because it also emphasizes, how people are responding to all of that sound in that place. And these are the things that I want to try and move us towards thinking about in conjunction with each other. And just leads me to a few statements I'd like to put forward about sound to sort of get us going a little bit, which is that sound is a way of knowing the world. It's a means of communicating. When we talk about sound, we're not only talking about music, although music sometimes is a part of sound. Sound is always mediated. And at the end, really most importantly, sound is for everyone. And I mean everyone, because ears are not the only way that you can hear. And in fact, if you're not familiar with her at all, Evelyn Glennie is deaf. And she is somewhat reluctant often to talk about her deafness, but she has on occasion, and she's very interesting what she has to say about it. The way she talks about hearing as this full body experience. When she performs on stage, she performs barefoot and senses vibration through her feet. She feels it in her chest cavity and in her hands as haptic feedback for striking the instruments that she's playing. And there's all kinds of ways that we can perceive sound. And it's that sort of almost universality of sound is what I think, one of the things I think makes it valuable as a research tool. Now, when we talk about combining sound and anthropology, we need to make a bit of a distinction, which is that sound is a physical phenomenon and the anthropology of sound is concerned with how we apply categories and interact with different sorts of sound. And the distinction that you can make between music and noise is one of these places where you see this in action. And I'm going to play you another short video. I apologize for the audio quality of this. I recorded this on my phone one night in San Francisco. It's only 10 seconds long, but you'll get the idea. So what you're listening to there is the overture to the Magic Flute being played via loudspeakers outside of McDonald's. And this is a thing that a lot of fast food restaurants and convenience stores, businesses like this do in cities as a kind of negative design, a design to keep people from doing things, namely undesirable people from congregating outside these businesses, these restaurants, and so on. There's a lot of problems with this, one of which is that there's no actual evidence that this has the desired effect. But even beyond that, it really raises a question, I think, about where this line between music and noise lies. This is music that in a lot of places is music, but is it still music when it's deployed in this aggressive way to sort of deter people from behaving in certain ways? I'm not convinced that it is when it's used as a weapon, when music is weaponized in this way. It's really relying on categories that we have of noise more than of music. So with that, my brief introduction to sound as knowledge ends, and we can move into sound in UX research. And here I will start with another video.
Audi is adding sound to its silent electric car models with a synthetic solution called Audi eSound. This replicated engine noise was developed not just to give the car audio appeal, but also to ensure pedestrian safety.
If you're driving in a very silent car, you may drive too fast because you think you're not driving the speed you're doing. But for the pedestrians, they do not recognize that there's a car coming if there isn't a noise that they can recognize.
Creating the right sound to match the sports car model did not happen overnight. Rather, it took 3 years to turn silence into this. The E sound is played through a loudspeaker located on the vehicle's undercarriage. Audi sound engineers had to develop hardware and software to create a specific sound that would identify the car as an electric vehicle, yet match its sporty design at the same time.
So here is an example of sound and research in action together. Audi is designing sound for these electric cars. They're also doing research on how that sound is designed and what's the right quality of sound for this purpose. You know, what does it mean to sound sporty in this case? What does it mean to you know, convey electric plus you know, extremely powerful? On top of which, you know, simply having that sound there is really critically important for both driver and pedestrians, as this video mentions. I'm now going to drop in a design term that some of you will surely criticize me, and rightly criticize me for using in this way, but that's sort of the point of it, which is just to remind us, for those of us who know, and for those of us who don't, introduce us to the concept of an affordance, which is a term famously associated with Don Norman, which is a relationship between the properties of an object and the capabilities of the agent that determine how the object could possibly be used. Introducing this term in conjunction with sound is a bit of a you know, sort of a provocation, I suppose, because Norman himself doesn't really think of sound as being, even possibly being, an affordance. But I don't want to necessarily accept that on its face. I want to push on that a little bit. So using affordance in this way, and I introduce it here to start making connections, but by the end of this talk, hopefully you'll have some understanding of why I want to see if we can think about sound and affordances together. But to get us back on track, doing research, doing UX research, design research with sound means that we need to hear with empathy. And this goes back to the research that I talked about a little bit in recording studios, learning how to hear how other people hear. It is, I think, largely a lack in design research. You know, we as researchers, we're usually quite comfortable with visual ideas of visual design, and the metaphor, like we commonly say, of seeing the world through someone else's eyes. Well, we don't really have a phrase for hearing through someone else's ears, but I think we need to, because if we're not hearing through other people's ears, and we're missing a lot of what is happening in the world, and we're missing a lot of how people experience the world. Because as I said before, in relation to Evelyn Glennie, we all hear in some way or other. Some of us rely on hearing as a primary way of understanding what's happening around us and interacting with the world. And if we don't take that into account, then we're really only getting capturing part of the experience that people have of the world. And that's really not great for doing UX research. One way to think about this is through the concept of the soundscape. And this is an analogy between to the term landscape. Soundscape was coined in the 70s by the Canadian composer Murray Schafer. Soundscape, quite simply, is just a collection of sounds in a particular space. And just like a landscape, you can describe the visual features of a place. In a soundscape, you can describe the sonic features of the place, all the different component sounds that make up the soundscape there. And once you do that, then you can start to move towards more interesting, more analytical sorts of of questions. Not just what does this place sound like, where we can talk about the timbre and the volume and the ambiance and the direction of different sounds, but rather what do the sounds of this place tell us about what happens here? What are the kinds of relationships that people have? What are the sources of the sound? How do particular sounds interact with others? And how do these things tell us about those human relationships and the design of the space and the structure of the space? So I'm going to conclude this section of the talk with two examples of very different valences. Here is number one. This is a microwave. And to start out with, a microwave is sort of an accessibility nightmare in some ways to begin. There's, if you can't see this device, there's nothing on this flat panel that would tell you how to use it. And frankly, with this microwave, there's very little on it, if you can see it, that tells you how to use it. It's just a weird machine. But this is also the microwave that we have in our house here. And therefore, I can additionally report that when it's done with its heating cycle, it plays a really annoying song. It makes us pretty crazy, honestly, because it goes on too long. It's not, it's just like something that some designer somewhere wrote for this purpose only. And I was very interested in this because not too long ago, I noticed my wife was heating up something and was standing in front of the microwave. And when it got to 1 second left, she pulled open the door so that she wouldn't have to listen to that alarm of the alert at the end. And that seems to me like it really defeats the point of having the alert there to begin with. I mean, having the alert, like the value of it is obvious. You know, it's a thing that tells you if you're distracted, if you're in another room, if you, for whatever reason, can't see or not near the thing, hey, your food is ready. But that doesn't mean that any alert at all is equal to any other. Like there still should be a level of thought and research and determination that goes into figuring out what is an effective way to convey that information through sound. And it's decisions like this that, quite frankly, in my opinion, are making our houses a lot more noisier and not to good effect when you have a washing machine that sings Schubert and you have a tea kettle that sings Chopin and you have a microwave that's playing some tune of its own invention. I mean, that's a lot of damn noise, quite frankly. And I don't think we really need all of it, at least not in that configuration. And you can sort of see this by contrast with a much more serious example. You may be familiar with, you probably are familiar with the Boeing 737 MAX crashes in 2019. In reading some of the materials reporting on those, I found some interesting things that were sound related. And I'll read a little bit of this quote from the NTSB's safety report on these incidents. While Boeing considered the possibility of uncommanded MCAS operation, it did not evaluate all the potential alerts and indications that could accompany a failure. Therefore, neither Boeing's system safety assessment nor its simulator tests evaluated how the combined effect of alerts and indications might impact pilots' recognition of which procedures to prioritize. So, in other words, what they found is that Boeing had put in all manner of alerts, you know, both visual and audible, but they didn't test how the pilots were perceiving those audible alerts. So something that needed their attention might not be getting their attention. And, you know, of course, to be clear, like, you know, I'm not claiming that poor acoustic design here was the cause of these incidents, but the alerts function to draw pilots' attention to things that say, hey, deal with this right now. And if there's too many of them, or if they're interfering with each other, then you need to figure out how pilots perceive these and what is the right way to sequence them. You know, what should come first? You know, you can't, you need to understand how pilots are going to react in that situation. It seems that Boeing quite simply did not do that research to figure that out. And just as an aside, this is not the first time that Boeing has had this problem. About 20 years ago, there was a plane crash that resulted from a cabin depressurization. And the reason that happened is because the alert that Boeing had built into their system to tell pilots about that was a redundant alert. It was the same alert that was used for, I forget what, but some mundane thing happening on the ground. And because it happened often on the ground for stuff that really didn't need to be attended to, pilots had learned to filter out that particular alert. So when it actually showed up in a context where it was conveying critical information, they didn't pay it any attention. And these are the kinds of things where sound can really help. But the flip side of that is that if you don't do the work to figure out how people perceive these things, it can really harm you as well in the end. So with that, I'm going to have a sip of water and move on to part 3. Now, in part 3, I want to put some of these pieces together and think about how we can take some of these ideas about acoustic anthropology and apply them to the realm of accessibility. And to introduce this part of the presentation, I'm going to tell you a short story from when in 2019, I was doing research for Uber with people who were blind or low vision. And I was interviewing this one woman who I'll call Marie. Marie's in her 60s, retired, forced into retirement because of her deteriorating vision. And she uses Uber as much as she can to get around. And in our interview, she was telling me about all of the different problems that she has, ordering rides, determining the different prices, finding her car on the street once she's ordered a ride. And in the course of that interview, she said to me, I understand, you know, Uber is not designed for people who have a vision problem. Now, Marie said this to me because she was in the middle of telling me all of the problems that she had using Uber, and she didn't want me to feel bad. She was trying to make me feel better about her experiences. At the same time, she put her finger on something that really is very precise and fundamental, that Uber is not designed for people who have a vision problem. That's a very precise wording of the situation, because in fact, it could have been designed for people who have a vision problem, but it was not, and that is a choice. Now here's a place where I'm going to make another little diversion to introduce some concepts that may be new, but maybe not new for some of you, which is 2 models of disability. There's an more old-fashioned model called the medical model, which locates disability in the person, the individual, where it's a problem to be rehabilitated. And there's a more modern social model of disability, where disability is located in the environment. It is, as Kat Holmes calls it, a mismatch between a person's capabilities and the designed context. And importantly, if we think about disability using the social model, then we can approach it as a design problem. You know, thus my emphasis on Marie's observation that Uber was not designed for people who have a vision problem. Give you a few examples of what mismatches can be. These pictures on the left illustrate this quite clearly. An allegedly accessible entrance to a building that has 2 steps leading up to it, a door that swings into a wheelchair ramp, which frankly is also too short and too steep, a curb cut that's not connected to any sidewalks. These are examples of mismatches. And what I have on the right here is also an example of a mismatch. And this is an email that Uber sent to all of its riders in the United States while I was working for them. They were trying to improve the safety of riders on their platform. So what they sent to people was, check your ride every time. Before you ride, please make sure you're getting in the right car with the right driver by opening up the app and completing 3 safety pickup steps. Match the license plate number, match the car make and model, check the driver's photo. Now, I was doing research, like I said, at Uber at the time with people who were blind or low vision. And the very next day after this email was sent, I conducted an interview with a man named Chuck, who is a frequent Uber user, and he explicitly referenced this email in our conversation. He said, "We just got an email saying, be safe, match the license plate and the color of the car." Well, that doesn't really work for us. And this is an example of how Uber was designing these mismatches. You know, they were creating circumstances where the information that they had determined that was relevant was not useful to everyone who was trying to get a ride. If you couldn't see the car to see the license plate, to see the color, then these things were not useful safety measures for you. And it's important, I think, to point out that partly this is a problem of, you know, it can be a problem of how we design the app or something like that. And I was told frequently that that Uber really needed to provide more information to screen readers, so that instead of just getting an estimated time of arrival for a car, you could provide the distance that the car was away and the direction that it would arrive from. And that would make the experience much easier and would help someone who can't see to find their car on the street. But not all of these scenarios can be solved with that sort of design, because if you're telling, you can use a screen reader on this screen, the pickup screen in the Uber app, and it will tell you the license plate number, it will tell you the color of the car, but that doesn't mean that that's useful information. You still haven't designed an inclusive experience when you do that. Now I'm going to give you another sound recording. This is one that I made myself in San Francisco on a Muni platform. And things to pay attention to here are the elements, the designed elements of the soundscape. There's a lot of stuff happening here, but the things that are designed and deliberate are pretty interesting, I think.
Arriving inbound, 1 car M to Embarcadero Station. Next J in 13 minutes, K in 3 minutes, L in 1 minute, M in 16 minutes, N in 11 minutes.
Arriving outbound, 2 car M to Ocean Beach. Next J in 3 minutes, K in 14 minutes, L in 6 minutes, M in 11 minutes, N in 8 minutes. Shuttle to West Portal Station in 8 minutes.
I always laugh a little bit when I listen back to that, because when I put it together, I was having a bit of a laugh just for myself. I edited in that conductor shouting "all aboard." I recorded that at a different place with a different train system, because there are no conductors who do that on the Muni system. But I just thought it would be fun. But anyway, what interests me here is the announcements. And there's a couple of layers to the announcements. And I talked about this with some of my colleagues at Uber after I had made this recording. And interestingly, even though they had lived in San Francisco a lot longer than me and had been riding Muni, none of them had noticed this aspect of the sound, which is that not only are there voice announcements saying, this is the train that's arriving, where it's going, these are the trains that are following, there's additional coding that goes in there, which is that for the inbound trains, the 2-note chime is low-pitched and descending, and then a woman's voice reads the announcement. For outbound trains, the 2-note chime is high-pitched and ascending, and a man's voice reads the announcement. And if you don't need this information to figure out what train is what, then you can very easily, simply just sort of filter it out. It's not necessarily going to be terribly useful information for you. But if you do need this information, if this helps you to figure out which direction is which, particularly in this kind of a situation, it's not necessarily obvious how it's coded on first hearing. You have to get used to it. You know, there's nothing inherent about a low-pitched descending chime that says inbound train. Like, that's just a convention that they've adopted. But having learned the convention, you can, you know, much more quickly get to figuring out what train going where it is that's arriving and that you can that you want to get on. And that's part of the way you can design a soundscape, a place, to be more inclusive, so that you know, just there's just more ways of using more senses to interpret this space. So these are things that properties, ideas I think we can use in conducting inclusive research. And inclusive research, I want to you know, stop on this term for a moment, because I think it requires a bit of explanation. In the first case, inclusive research means having more diverse research participants. And that's a really important thing, because UX research programs are really generally quite good at finding core users who are already having a pretty good experience with their product and learning about how things work for them. But UX programs are also pretty bad at finding users who are not those core users, finding people who are struggling or having trouble in some way, or are not users at all, but might like to be. And it's those users that you can learn a lot from. And that's and our research pools need to be diversified in that way to make outcomes more inclusive. But we go beyond that for inclusive research, and I like the way that Melanie Nind phrases this, which is that inclusive research means that we're doing research with, by, or for people, but not on people. Conceiving of participants as collaborators in the research process. And again, you know, we in research, we are very comfortable with the idea that people are experts in their own experience. But again, if those experiences are not particularly diverse, then you don't need such, you know, as much sense of expertise from these people. But once you start in places where programs where doing research with people with disabilities has never been undertaken, that doesn't fly. You need a much more collaborative, deeper engagement with people in order to really understand the nature of their experiences and how they can be served by whatever it is you're trying to build. Importantly, for my purposes here also, inclusive research happens on the participants' terms and in their preferred modalities. There's a method in UX research you may be familiar with called participant photography, where you ask research participants, either with their phone or with the camera you provide them, to document their experience in some form or other. You know, go to this place and take pictures of what's important to you, or, you know, whatever the case may be. That's a method that really largely relies on people being sighted. So you can't use that modality. Well, you can use that modality, but it might not be the best modality if you're dealing with blind research participants. So to try and solve this problem at Uber, I did something that I call participatory phonography. Which is basically the same thing as participant photography, except that instead of vision, we use sound recording instead of photography. And what we did was I went with several research participants to places of their choosing. I set them up with my recording equipment. There's a whole story behind that, which we can talk about later if you want. But I set them up with my recording equipment, which was a 4-channel recorder, a shotgun microphone, and a pair of headphones. and basically just asked them to record the place we're in. Try and use the shotgun microphone, which is very directional, to capture sounds that they found interesting or that held particular meaning to them. And then we talk through this process afterwards so that I can start to get a little bit of a sense of how they're hearing, not just what is perceived in the environment, but also how they're interpreting that. So I want to play you an example of this now. And this is a soundscape on Market Street in San Francisco. This was co-created with a woman who I interviewed and worked with for this project. She is blind and she travels with a dog, and we did this on a walk up Market Street. And the nature of the collaboration here was that I held the recorder with the stereo pair of microphones. She held with one hand the shotgun microphone, and with her other hand her dog's harness. And she tried to capture sounds of interest as we walked up the street together from her place of work to the BART station where she gets the train home every night. I'll play this for you now without any more comment.
Sorry. Chociaż tam jest. To the curb, buddy. Good boy.
It makes me really happy that we captured her praising her dog, because I love that moment in that recording. So there's a lot of chaos in that recording. There's just a ton of stuff happening there, really, and a lot of it is literally just the randomness of a busy street, which is itself interesting enough, because when you're designing, say, an app of some sort, you, to a certain extent, at least, you need to account for the context in which people are going to use it, and especially with a rideshare app, but with a lot of things, that is the context where people are going to use it. So if you're not thinking about that at least some of the time, you're not capturing all of the use cases and the scenarios that your product might enter into. But there are also design elements in there, most notably, I think, the crosswalk signal for when it's safe to go across, and she captured that very well with the shotgun microphone, because that's obviously a thing that for her is an important signifier of this is what it's safe to cross the street now in this place. It gives both location, and it gives the action that is appropriate there. So that element of design is really important. And we need to think about that when we are creating these things, because, well, I'll close now with one final story from my research at Uber. And I put it in conjunction with this Market Street soundscape, because the story I'm relating is about a person getting a ride just off of Market Street. So this is basically the sonic context that they were telling me about in this story. And so this person is blind and ordered a ride using the Uber app and was waiting for the ride. And as they often did, called the driver to try and make the pickup easy. Hey, I'm blind, I can't see you, here's where I am, you need to look for me. I heard that a ton from people I interviewed. You know, lots of people do that to just to help coordinate things, because this is a chaotic environment, and Uber, as I showed you before, is not doing a whole hell of a lot to help people who are blind or low vision to find their car. So this is the strategy that a lot of people adopted. In this particular case, though, something sort of remarkable happened purely by coincidence. As this person was on the phone with the driver, they said, I was on the phone at the time and a car pulled up and I heard my voice coming out of it. I heard their voice coming out of two places at once. So, okay, there's the car. Now, this was not designed into the app. This was pure coincidence that the rider was on the phone with the driver, and the driver was taking the call on the speakers in the car and happened to pull up at exactly the time when they were talking to each other with the windows rolled down, because it was a non-rainy, pleasant day in San Francisco. All of those factors together meant that this one time, there was an absolutely foolproof way for this person to find the right car and get into it, because they heard their own voice coming out of the car. Can't mistake it, right? So the objective, the design objective here is, how can we replicate this? I mean, we brainstormed this. You know, I went back and talked with colleagues, and we brainstormed this. And there's all kinds of ways you can replicate this, none of which were taken up by the company. But that's the goal that we need to have, because, you know, let's say 10 years in the future, 15 years in the future, we live in a world where Ubers are self-driving. That's really not, you know, that radical a proposal, right? There's no longer a driver in the car. There's no longer a driver for this individual to call to help coordinate the pickup. So are we then just discarding that whole potential interaction? Or are we going to replace it with something that helps this person find the right car? And because it now becomes a design feature of the car, helps the person find the car regularly, all the time. And this is why, you know, this is the kind of thing that we can do when we pay attention to the sonic context and the ways that we can use sound within the designs in that context. And I'm going to stop there, and I would love to have questions and discussion, because I'm sure I hopefully provoked a few thoughts, I hope.
Since everybody's so shy, and you know me, I'm not. Thank you, Greg. This was a great, really great presentation, because I think it made us all think beyond what we were expecting from this presentation, especially towards the end. Yeah, so a little bit of research has been done in terms of sound by people who create voice apps. So there is a way that you can make sound like a question or like a acknowledgement of something. If you think of Star Trek and the beeps that you would hear from the computer, I think you know what I'm talking about. So I think that that's something that we could really include in a lot more digital experiences that are not voice only, but just in general. And then a user should be able to personalize his or her, their app, and can switch them off if they don't like them. And also to address something like all the noises in the house. And again, personalization would help if you could personalize how you want your devices to sound, or if you want it at all, or if you want to change the noise level too. So anyway, those are my thoughts, but great presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. And yeah, that's really sort of cool stuff. I'd love to talk more about that at some point. You know, one thing that you made me think of, though, is I've seen some discussions about how you can use like voice interfaces or sonic signifiers or whatever to imitate like vocal patterns. And it's very interesting to think in those ways, but because what we're doing when we create this sort of sound design is essentially creating arbitrary connections that people use and learn over time. I'm not sure we even necessarily need to imitate vocal patterns. I'm not saying that we shouldn't. I'm saying that like we can feel a lot freer in the way that we design those circumstances.
Oh, just to expand on this a little bit, and I don't want to hog the conversation, the benefit would be to, as always, you benefit accessibility, you include accessibility, more inclusive, you benefit everybody. So really it's, you know, if you want to shorten a conversation with Alexa, for instance, you can replace some of the conversational elements that Alexa, you know, you could as a designer, for instance, or a developer, you could, and she's listening to me right now, and just see the light ring coming up. But you could, for instance, after a user has used your app a few times, you could no longer ask, would you like to continue? If would you like to continue? Would you like to find out more? Is always accompanied by a specific sound that sounds like a question. After a while, you can drop the language and it makes the entire experience a little bit smoother because now you don't have to listen to the entire, you know, the entire conversation. You can just have shortcuts. A little bit like, you know, buttons that are a shortened way to interact with something. Instead of having an entire phrase, you just have a button and you kind of get what it's for, or an icon.
Yeah.
Some sound icons, by the way.
Earcons.
Earcons, yeah.
I have a Greg. First of all, very inspiring. Great talk. Really like it. Respect. But I have it's gonna come off rude, but I'm curious what's next. So you gave us this talk. I'm very inspired. How do I apply this to my design, everyday design? What do I do now? Do I look for ways to incorporate sound into an accessible design, or do I like what's next? Any suggestions? Any advice?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, and one that I should have anticipated more, considering that this is not an academic talk. This is you know, people who actually make things. But I think there's any number of ways. I think any number of answers to what's next, and you know, without sounding too zen or anything, like, you know, practicing listening, I think, is a really important thing of what's next. You know, just like teaching yourself to tune into elements of a sound environment that you're in, because there's so much that that we filter out all the time, to the point where we you know, don't necessarily capture a lot of, in our heads, we don't capture a lot of what actually is going on sonically around us. And you can't do stuff, you know, create good sound design or whatever in an environment if you're not attuned to those sorts of things. Beyond that, I mean, I don't know, go if you work in a particular field, you know, look at what your product and, you know, what competing products do in sound, if anything. And if it's not anything, you know, start asking, like, where would sound actually help this experience? The answer may be that it won't, or only very minimally will it, or, and this is the important point, for some people, it will help a lot. And that's the one that you need to make sure that you're paying attention to, right? Because if it doesn't help the experience, then who cares? Like, you know, it's irrelevant. Like, you know, you don't, the whole point of the microwave story was don't put sounds in just for the sake of having sounds there. But when you find a place where you can anticipate that somebody would need a sound in order to work with it, then you know, there are experts in this. There are people that are experts in that much more than I am, that can help, like, figure out, you know, what's the right sound to put here. How do we figure that out? And how do we create it? How do we synthesize it or record it or whatever the case may be?
Do you mind if I just add a quick note to that?
Yeah, of course, Lindsay.
Yeah, so I would definitely, like, everything you said. I mean, also, yeah, I mean, I've done a lot of accessibility consulting, and just I think of it as accessibility, and also just like thinking about what it's like to experience the world in a particular way. In my case, being blind, I think of myself as a non-visual designer. So I would definitely recommend, as much as possible, just having people that you can consult with, either like as professionally, like to have, to be like, hey, look, like, okay, so we're thinking of designing this thing, and being able to have a conversation about, for especially people who really do rely on sound, there might just be a lot that like you won't think about if maybe sound isn't your primary way of perceiving. So having accessibility consultants or people on your team, or just people like around you that you can bat ideas off of with, and think about stuff that maybe you just like hadn't thought about before. Because I find that happens a lot, where like I'll have conversations with people, and they'll be like, I'll just bring up something, and people will just be like, oh my goodness, I just never thought that, this is a thing. So yeah, just having people who like love sound and really rely on sound as part of the process, I think could offload some of that responsibility. I mean, it would make it so that you still have to design and think about all of that, but also where like you're not having to be the one to like try and come up with all the solutions or all the scenarios, but you're actually having people that can relate to that experience.
Yeah. Nothing to add to that. Perfect.
By the way, when you were talking, like all the points you brought up, I was just so like, yes, like so excited, because all of this I'm just really happy that that somebody is like really focused on this kind of work. Because I mean, just as somebody who uses sound and touch to interact with the world, it's so often that like I find myself kind of being in this position of having to defend sound, and having to sort of explain that like sound isn't just like something that we should have a contentious relationship with, and it's not just noise, and it's not just something to minimize, but it's actually something to like welcome and use in a useful way. And for instance, like as you were talking, we were all when you were playing those subway sounds from San Francisco, I was thinking about just my last trip before COVID hit, which was to San Francisco and to the Bay Area. And it just like brought back just that hearing the sounds of the subways and like the announcements and all just the ambient noises. It just made me feel like I was there, and it brought back like that nostalgia of being like, oh my goodness, I want to be back on board. I want to be back on board someday, and all of that. So it's like such a powerful tool.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have a follow-up question. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I have a follow-up question kind of about like the research side of things. So when you are, having your participants point their directional microphone, I don't remember what you called it again, but when they're recording their environments and stuff, how do you know out of all that sound and frankly noise, like what is and isn't relevant? Do you sit down with the participants and have them highlight, like, I was listening to this was important to me, or how do you determine what's important out of all of that sound?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and that's exactly right. Like, I don't is the answer to that, because it's not my experience that that we're interested in. It has to come from them. So it was always, when I was doing those recordings, I never got to do it with the sort of richness that I wanted to in post-recording discussions, which was frankly just a limit of how much time Uber was willing to pay participants to spend with me. But there was always a conversation afterwards about what they had captured and what they were experiencing and the things that they felt were important to them. And that's the only way you can do that, I think, meaningfully. I mean, you can do other things without having that conversation, but if you want to know how they're hearing, it's not just about capturing it, it's about understanding how they're interpreting it as well.
I just wanted to say it sounded almost like note taking, kind of like you're there, and instead of taking notes, it's almost like recording note taking. And then when they explain, is more like, let's revisit the notes and what did you notice, kind of thing.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like you could do also visually with a camera on your phone or something like that.
Yeah, in fact, it reminded me of a project I did back in grad school where I was supposed to represent a 24-hour period. And so I carried a cassette recorder with me for an entire day. From the time I woke up, the first thing I did was turn it on, and then I recorded the entire day until I went to bed that night. And then I had to edit it down together into I forget, a minute or 2 minutes or something like that, picking out the recognizable snippets of sound that represented the day. And it's interesting. I still have a memory of almost everything that happened that day, even though it wasn't a special day in any other way than the fact that I recorded the whole thing and played it back later.
Greg, I have another question for you. So I asked about what's next for us, but now I'm curious what's next for you. Are you going to continue the research? Are you going to do anything else related to this topic in the near future?
Oh boy, I hope so. I mean, at the moment, this is sort of a bit of a passion project, right? Because I mean, number one, it doesn't require, but it's greatly helped by being able to do in-person research. And that is an obstacle at the moment. Number two, this kind of thing, at least for the moment, I mean, everyone that I work with who's on this call, take note of me saying this, because this is well outside my job description for the moment to be able to do this kind of work, but hopefully we can change that one day. But it's a hard sell, honestly, because this is not, this is, you know, I'm well aware that this is well outside of like the mainstream of UX research methodologies, right? Like, so, you know, if nothing else, what I hope this sort of presentation is at least like a little bit of a proof of concept that there's more that we can do with this method, and if we had a chance to do it. And I don't know. So at the moment, like I'm making soundscape recordings myself, but I haven't done more research with people doing this kind of thing recently. So you know, if you have need of it, please let me know. I would love to have another opportunity to get the microphones out and do this stuff again.
Can I just play back something? It's just short. All right. So to show how far we've come, think back to
You've got mail.
the first time, like when people started getting emails and you had to spell it out for them, you had to spell out what it was that was happening on their computer. And now we have chimes so we can personalize. Maybe we can get to that point with, you know, sounds everywhere.
But not too much of them.
Yeah,
or at least not the wrong ones. Nothing too excessive.
How cool would it be if you could have like a symphony going that you as a user, you decide what instrument is this machine and what specific sound does it make? And when they come together, it's like this pleasant, like chimes, you know, wind chimes? Wind chimes play together and they're soothing. You could have something like this, or you could choose not to. That's where personalization comes in.
Yeah, I don't know why we keep like thinking in separate mediums. Like I feel if there was like, because alarms are alarms at the end of the day. If the interface, like alarms is at the back end of the system, and then you could choose, I want a sound for this, I want a vibration for that, I want like visual sounds. Like I feel like it's weird how we're kind of ascribing it, but if there was a hub and you could just pick and assign, I feel like you could just get your perfect mix for you, and it wouldn't be that hard from a computer perspective, right?
I'm reminded of a talk. I want to say it's called Calm Design, and I can't remember where I saw that, but yeah, we're bad about how we get everyone's attention for everything because we think that we're the only thing in that context, to like make a chime or get someone's attention. And we have human beings have, you know, periphery and other ways of perceiving things, and we don't always want the most in your face thing. I can't remember where that was from, if anybody knows. Calm Design, I think, was the presentation.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because you know, this is that level of customization is awesome if you're talking in fairly isolated contexts, but it gets a lot harder when you have people in a group in a context of some sort, and everyone has their customized alerts and chimes and whatnot, and then you know, that it's not hard to imagine how that can get quickly overwhelming.
Greg, do you have a rule of thumb on when you capture sound for your research, you capture a soundscape, how much time you want to give yourself to go back through and listen? So kind of similar to a user interview, you know, that sort of rule of thumb to do the analysis work on that. Do you have a rule of thumb that you give yourself for that?
Not really, no. You know, there's making a soundscape recording for me is sort of like when I do it right, or when I feel like I've done it right, it was a very meditative kind of activity, actually. And I'm not a person who meditates or anything, but you know, sitting and listening and just capturing sound for even as short as 10 minutes is a fairly intense experience, and sort of reliving it. You know, again, can, you know, as some of you have already remarked upon, like bringing those sounds back, you know, can, you know, remind you of that level of intensity again, or the things that were happening. Although, of course, as you probably imagine, you hear all kinds of stuff that you didn't notice the first time around. So, I mean, no rule of thumb, honestly, just try and, you know, be as attentive as I can, I suppose.
Can I bring one idea to the, I don't know if this is doable, but like I'm working on map making right now where people from memory would draw things to understand their mental model. Could you do like a soundscape like that? Like sort of like maybe give them a keyboard and each key has a different sound or something, and be like, map for me the journey from your work to this thing, and then see what is salient for them. And then maybe like if you compared it across people and maybe had like coding for it, could you start seeing like, oh, this thing keeps popping up, or some people are perceiving this and it's helping them do it better? Or I wonder if that might be, instead of us capturing so much, because the soundscape has like some stuff that's important, but also some stuff that's just loud and disruptive and just they didn't want to capture it, it was just there.
There's a coming from the other direction in terms of maps, there's an app by Microsoft called Soundscape, which is sort of serves this sort of function. It doesn't have that variety of sounds. Like it uses like pings with different intensities and different locations in the stereo field to convey direction and distance sonically through a map. I've tried to use it and I've had limited success with it, but I've been told that it can be quite a good experience also. So anyway, like a thing does exist that tries to do this sonically.
Okay, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Greg. That was a great talk. Lots of kudos in the chat. We did get it recorded. We'll communicate out how we actually can make that and the transcript available soon. Thank you all. Great conversation. Enjoy the rest of your evening or day or wherever you are in the world.
Thank you all. Thank you, Jack and Anna.
Thank you so much, Greg. This was awesome.